Okay, this video is about Ancel Keys and the Mediterranean diet. It started because I started reading this paper about Ancel Keys' personal reflections on the Mediterranean diet written in 1995. Now, he was an old guy. He lived a long life, 100 years, from 1904 to 2004, and he wrote back about his memories of it. And McDougall praised him very much, said he was an American hero, a great nutrition researcher. And what has happened is paleo, keto, carnivore, low-carb communities, they all try to demonize Ancel Keys because he helped to show what a joke their diets are, okay? They always want to demonize the research that shows that saturated fat is bad, and they always try to demonize epidemiology because it shows the more meat and dairy a community eats, the fatter and sicker they get and the more coronary artery disease that they have. Basically, there is no data to suggest that for any population eating paleo, keto, carnivore, low carb is a good idea. It's all a big nonsense joke. And the reason people promote it is there's a lot of money. If you lie to the public, you get paid money. You tell them the truth, you don't get anything, okay? So that's why people have to have ethical backgrounds, or otherwise, they'll just be a bunch of snakes. There's no money in telling the truth to the pros. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about Ancel Keys. So this is the paper that I was reading, Mediterranean Diet, Public Health, Personal Reflections. And another thing you're going to notice is, when you go to this through the standard library approaches, the standard PubMed approaches, they won't let you read the article. They don't want you to know the truth. Very often that is the case. Something that would actually help the public, that the public could understand, that would help them, it gets hidden behind a paywall. You have to pay to buy the whole article. I have ways to get the whole article that I don't have to pay, but most people will run into that. They'll be stuck. McDougall used to offer some Sci-Hub thing, I forget the address, I have it somewhere, how you can get articles for free even if they try to make you pay for them. So I don't remember what that was, but if you watch McDougall's, you'll find it on one of his videos. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here's the area of the Mediterranean diet. When you think of the Mediterranean, we mostly think about Italy and Greece. Okay, Yugoslavia is mixed in there, but mostly Italy and Greece. The other thing that's funny is where Ancel Keys was especially impressed was as you go down further south, the people are healthier because they eat more plant foods. There's more access to fruits and vegetables year-round compared to being up north. But the farther north one would go in Italy, the fatter and sicker the people would be. There'd be like a gradient of disease the more north you go because there's a gradient of animal food consumption. The other thing that's a little bit funny is the people in Crete were relatively healthy, and the joke was that Mediterranean diet should have been called the Cretan diet, but nobody wanted to call it that, so it's the Mediterranean diet. Nowadays in Greece, they eat too much olive oil and they tend to be quite fat because things have changed. I mean, the Mediterranean diet, the 6-7 country study, a lot of Ancel Keys' work, remember he's born in 1904, so he did a lot of his big research in the 1950s and 60s, and things have gotten much worse since then. So it used to be people started eating too much meat right after World War II, and then Keys made a mistake. His big mistake was he thought, well, gee, if you just switch out the saturated fat from animal foods for PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, like the omega-6 cooking oils, for example, that would be an advantage because they did not have such a big effect as far as raising cholesterol, but they still raise triglycerides a lot. They're still very atherogenic. So anyways, later on it was shown, they did a follow-up study, and it showed that there was no advantage to the PUFAs over the saturated fat. They're both highly atherogenic, okay? And I can remember when I was a kid growing up, I would hear stories, from my parents, oh, so-and-so, Mr. this or that, dropped dead from a heart attack, dropped dead from a heart attack. That was real common. Lots of famous people would just drop dead from a heart attack. Okay, here's the 7 countries that they studied in the 7-country study, very famous study. And the big thing was Japan ate the lowest amount of saturated fat, and they had the least amount of coronary artery disease. The amount of saturated fat is a bigger predictor of whether or not you're going to develop coronary artery atherosclerosis, more so than is the amount of dietary cholesterol doesn't matter that much. You only have cholesterol in animal foods. You don't get cholesterol from plant foods. So just saying dietary cholesterol, it's relatively small amounts. Our body can produce cholesterol, and I'll actually tell you secretly between the lines what I think is going on. T. Colin Campbell had written that the more animal protein you eat, the higher your cholesterol. And what do I think is happening? I think that what happens is the animal protein induces a bit of an anabolic effect on mTOR. mTOR is mammalian targeted rapamycin. It's a nutrient sensing pathway. It's like a building contractor. The building contractor is waiting for all the building materials to be available before it starts to build. So what happens is it tends to be the rate limiting step to activate mTOR tends to be the availability of methionine and leucine. Both of those are much more common in animal food. So animal protein has more of the amino acids needed to activate mTOR. Plus it's got more sat fat. Sat fat will cause insulin resistance. Insulin resistance will elevate insulin-like growth factor from the liver. That also activates mTOR. Plus the meat, especially red meat, will have higher iron amounts, and that also helps activate mTOR. So basically, meat is good for activating mTOR, all right? Milk is good for increasing insulin-like growth factor. So this anabolic effect of time to build, time to replicate cells is going to push up blood lipids. And that's also why animal protein in and of itself has atherogenic properties, okay? But anyways, the worst countries were USA and Finland, where they had the highest intakes of saturated fat. And so what Ancel Keys most conclusively showed is that saturated fat is bad. It's very atherogenic, increases your risk of heart disease, raises your total cholesterol. It was a major cause of raising total cholesterol. When you raise total cholesterol, you raise LDL cholesterol. It's a bridging molecule, sticks your red blood cells together, overcomes the zeta potential on the red blood cells. They're negative charge. They stick together. That makes them prothrombotic. Now you're pumping thick blood up to the top of your head. That's why you have a blood pressure, to get blood to the top of your cerebral cortex. And because they have to pump it against gravity. When you're pumping thick blood, pressure has to go up. When you pump at a high pressure, you start damaging your arterial walls, and that also is atherogenic, prothrombotic, okay? Plus, the sat fat's also diabetogenic, so and then you have insulin resistance and everything that goes with that. Okay, so it's all bad, okay? The PUFAs are bad, the sat fats are bad, and in a recent talk, if you look over at VegSource where I was analyzing the debate on olive oil, you'll see I go into some detail about all the problems with MUFAs, monounsaturated fatty acids like oleic acid of olive oil. They're all bad. All fats are bad. Nathan Pritikin was right, so was Dr. McDougall. Nathan Pritikin said fat is bad. Dr. McDougall said the fat you eat is the fat you wear. Fat is the main toxin in the Western diet. Okay, so anyways, these are the 7 countries of the 7-country study of Ancel Keys and the rest of his group. So it was a major epidemiologic research study, and Keys, supervised and ran it. Okay, so these were the places that did well. Southern Italy was relatively healthy. Crete was relatively healthy. Japan, relatively healthy. Okay, and they had really low intakes of saturated fat versus the high sat fat intakes. USA and Finland were not healthy. Lots of coronary artery disease. Okay, so Ancel Keys is also famous for a human starvation study, done around 1950 after World War II with conscientious objectors. And Dr. McDougall has a lot of has a lecture where he talks about that in some detail. Let's see what else. Ancel Keys also developed something called the K rations. They're very concentrated, high-calorie thing. That's not really related to health stuff. Oh, Ancel Keys also pointed out lots of people having the heart attacks were the rich businessmen. Okay, why were the richest people who should be eating the healthiest food the sickest? Because they're eating too much saturated fat. Okay, and Dr. McDougall saw the same thing when he was in Hawaii. The manual laborers eating plant-based diets, they were skinny and healthy in their 60s. The guys would retire at 65. The Filipino men go back to the Philippines, get a bride in their 20s, raise a whole other family, live to their late 80s or 90s. Versus the wealthy, educated people in Hawaii were all, dying of heart attacks and cancer in their 60s and 70s. Let's see, this was a 7-country study. Northern Italy ate more meat, fatter, and sicker. Let's see what else I got in here. And Keys concluded the biggest risk factor for coronary artery disease is the percent of calories in your diet from saturated fat, because those have the biggest effect to increase total cholesterol in your blood. He also found that other risk factors included, being obese, hypertensive, a lack of exercise. And he didn't catch it initially, but later on it was shown that the PUFAs were just as bad as sat fat for saturated fat, polyunsaturated fatty acids. The omega-6 cooking oils were just as bad as sat fat for being atherogenic, okay? And then later on, we talked about it before in the 1970s, David Blankenhorn had shown that MUFAs, monounsaturated fatty acid like olive oil, was just as atherogenic as the sat fat in the PUFAs. Keys also wrote in his 1995 paper, Reflections on the Mediterranean Diet, it's in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition if you want to look it up, that the original Mediterranean diet was much more of a vegetarian diet, much more plants, lots and lots of greens. And for dessert, they would just have a piece of fruit. Nowadays, people have ice cream for dessert, okay? So the Mediterranean diet of today is much higher in fat, much higher in animal foods than it was in his day, okay? And much higher in other oils, too, okay? Okay, here's a picture of Ancel Keys. Let me get myself out of the way here. And here he is, looking at one of his graphs. He did a lot of his research at the University of Minneapolis, and he just talked about the things like I'm just mentioned here. The northern countries that eat more meat and dairy, and they'd be fatter and sicker. Okay. And so he really was, a big force in research, man. He became very famous. Everybody was reading his book about the Mediterranean diet. He became rich from that. He actually got to kind of travel around, buy a nice house in the Mediterranean area. And he and his wife loved to travel and do research together, so it was very nice. It's he's a great old American nutrition research hero. The other stuff is just this paper, what we talked about. I just show these papers here in case anybody wants to look them up, so they're there so you could see them. Okay, and so that's basically it. So anyways, Ancel Keys, American hero research, and his name gets smeared because he dared to tell the truth to the pros that saturated fat is something to be avoided. So anyways, hope that was helpful.